Discussion on the analysis on, of the directive on mediation in civil and commercial matters, and I will give the floor to Professor Giuseppe de Palo. He is Professor of Alternative Dispute Resolution Law and Practice at Mitchell Hamline School of Law, St. Paul, USA. And I think you have 15 minutes. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this invitation. Good morning, everyone. As you can tell from the title, I decided to go straight to the point, summarizing a long, single-spaced briefing note. And in 15 minutes, I will try to explain why, in my opinion, the directive has failed its goals, has been an important milestone, but a milestone still very far away from the finish line, why that happened, and what the European Union and the member states can do to resolve things. In fact, in certain circles, the 2008 directive has been referred to, has given rise to a paradox. There are at least 5 elements to this paradox. The first one is that mediation is much talked about it, much praised, and yet after 10 years, only 1%, maybe less than 1% of all the litigated cases in civil and commercial areas go through mediation. That means that Article 1 of the directive, which calls for more mediations and a guarantee of a balanced relationship actually, between judicial proceedings and mediation is not there. A balanced relationship would assume a good number of both. The third, and Vice Chair Delvaux was right on point about that, in 2014, the European Parliament was presented with a study quantifying the cost for EU citizens and businesses of non-mediation. That number was referred to as impressive, but Commissioner Jourova back then, Eurochambre quantified that number in 20 to 40 billions per year. The fourth element is that the lack of mediation puts enormous stress on the public judicial systems. And not many people know that the judicial system, the civil judicial system, is not funded by the litigants, those who go to court and pay the court fees. On average, those who litigate only pay 25% of the cost. The balance, 75%, is paid via general taxation by those who do not litigate. The fifth, and to me most important, is the consideration that there are hidden costs when mediation does not take place. Conflict, ladies and gentlemen, is a growth industry. We must expect much more, not much less. In a more interconnected world, all organizations, companies need to become more flat to reach customers, employees all over the world. And flatness means more conflict. Anytime people resort immediately to court, resort to violence, or just don't do anything, they just absorb conflict, as opposed to negotiate, mediate, engage in the difficult conversation, we as planet Earth, I think, miss something. The conflict, the paradox of the mediation has been resolved in part in one EU member state and more in a nearby country, which is Turkey. Italy has had, since 2013, maybe 15 to 20 times as many mediations as any other member state. In addition to the sheer number of mediations, official data have also shown that new cases in the areas where mediation is in place have been reduced by 30% on average. It's not that people do not litigate anymore. They negotiate, they mediate. In certain areas, for example, real estate, the drop before and after the new mediation law is up to 49%. Mediation is only applicable in 15% of all the cases. And in those cases, these are the results. In the balance, 85%, there are very, very few mediations and no fewer cases. So it's not that Italians became all of a sudden more inclined to mediation. The rules have acted as an on-off switch. The same has happened in Turkey as of the beginning of this year, when a new law based on the Italian model started to generate from a few thousand mediations per year to 200,000 per year, success rate of 67%. diminishing new cases in the areas, and as we can expect, as we speak, the Turkish legislator is trying to adopt the same mechanism to all commercial disputes in light of this success. So what is this on-off, open-close switch? It's actually very simple. It's the entry mechanism into the mediation. In countries with low or very low mediations, the parties, the litigants, are entirely free not to make any effort at mediation. They must decide jointly that they will try. They need to opt in. In countries with a lot of mediation, not just Italy and Turkey, but all over the world, the mechanism is the opposite. It is opt out. The parties are expected to make an effort to meet. Then they can say no. They don't have to settle, of course. They do not even have to mediate all the way through, but they must meet together to give it a try. The best way to explain both the power and the simplicity of the opt-in versus opt-out methodology, I think, comes still today from the 2003 study by Johnson and Goldstein on saving lives. At the time, it was hard in certain states to find organs to be donated when people needed a transplant. And researchers looked at what was the effective consent. Of course, consent is needed for people to donate their organs. And researchers found surprising that there was no country of those inspected where there would be 40%, 50%. In these countries, either very few people consented or a lot of people consented. In the countries in yellow, for example, explicit consent was needed. Germany, one of them. In blue countries, consent was presumed. That means that people had to pick up the pen in Germany and write on a form, yes, I agree that my organs will be donated. Now, who wants to think about death? Who's got the time to pick up the pen? Very few people sign, no organs would be donated, people would die. In blue countries, the form was different. And it says, please write here if you do not want us to donate your organs. Once again, people do not want to think about death, do not have the time to make the signature, they do not sign, and organs get donated. Lives can be saved. Opt-in versus opt-out. The opt-in, opt-out methodology is very important if we keep in mind how humans tend to make decisions, especially in the context of uncertainty. For the first time in 2002, the Nobel Prize in economics was not awarded to an economist, but to a psychologist who explained the concept of limited rationality under uncertainty. And the typical decision under uncertainty is the decision to mediate or not, because we are faced with a choice between making a deal, which is certain, and the possibility of going to court and getting more, getting less. We are far, far less rational than we would like to be. Last year, an economist, Richard Thaler, received the Nobel Prize, again, on the issues of limited rationality and lack of self-control. The solution to lots of problems, eating healthy, encouraging people to save for retirement, lies in the default rule. People, or the majority of them, will tend to do what the default rule is. If we want people to save for retirement early, we need to automatically enroll them, giving them the chance to opt out. But that has to be the default choice. If we want kids to eat healthier food, that food has to be placed in a different place on the shelf, or else the default choice will be another one. The solution for us, people should be nudged, should be accompanied, should be channeled to mediate more, because otherwise they will not do it automatically. This analysis allows us to see the weakness, the non-directiveness of Directive 2008. You can see on screen the mechanism that basically has two flaws from my point of view. It does not provide for an opt-out mechanism. It only allows member states to provide a required mandatory mechanism. Second, it doesn't say what that opt-out mechanism would look like. How long should the mediation last? How much should it cost to be acceptable? I believe that the legislator, like many other legislators in the world, was blindsided by the idea that by focusing on mediation quality, confidentiality, enforceability, which are requirements for mediation to function, People would just love the process because it makes sense and engage in it. Also, people thought that by promoting a culture of mediation, people will eventually understand and embrace it. Well, the numbers prove that to be wrong. And a couple of thousand years before the Nobel Prize was established, Roman poet Ovidius said it best: I see and approve of the best, of the better, but I follow the worse. People do not do spontaneously what is the right thing to do. If that was the case, we would not need cops. We would not need traffic lights, roundabouts. We would not need seatbelt laws or helmet laws. Who knows what poet Ovidius would do today in Rome if there was no obligation to wear a helmet, and instead of riding a horse, he was riding a Vespa. I think I know what he would do. 2 years after the directive, the Court of Justice intervened to fix the limits of the mediation directive. It said two very important things. These are actual quotes from the Alassini case of 2010. First of all, if you want the system to be efficient, it cannot be optional. It has to be opt-out, cannot be opt-in. This is not the mediator speaking. This is the Court of Justice. The second thing is said, it provided the parameters for that mediation to be effective, but also constitutionally sound, not binding, fast, must suspend the statute of limitation, as must be free or very low cost. In the light of all that, the empirical evidence about where mediation was working, the contribution from social sciences, from behavioral economics especially, about decision-making, the contribution of the court led in 2014 to this parliament being presented with an option to change Article 5.2 so as to put all these things together. As you can see, the requirement would be for the parties to meet together with the mediator, not to mediate, in a process that is non-binding, swift, suspends the period, and is free of charge. I'm looking at the part in bullet now, and provides for an easy opt-out. In 2014, the Parliament decided to wait. In fact, in 2016, the directive was coming up for a re-evaluation. This proposal was represented in 2016, but as Vice Chair Delvaux mentioned, in 2017, the Parliament decided again not to change. It decided to leave the directive unchanged. By leaving the directive unchanged, the Parliament left national legislators in the dark about how to eventually make mediation work. 4 countries, their experiences as described in the briefing note, have struggled to come up with legislation which will be either ineffective because it relies on opt-in mechanism, or would be constitutionally subject to challenges because the opt-out mechanism is not designed wisely. Actually, the Romanian Supreme Court has already quashed twice legislative attempts to create mediation. And you can imagine what happens in a country where an industry is being created, where people invest, try to set up a system, and then it's washed out by a court decision. Sadly, the ones who do not benefit from mediation and all the losses at the end of the day are EU citizens and businesses. Quite a number of people contributed to this paper and this presentation. They are all acknowledged in the note. Some of them gave me particular help, so I wanted to especially recognize their names. And I guess I'm speaking also on their behalf when I'm saying to the distinguished members of this parliament who will not seek re-election, good luck. To those who will seek re-election, I also say good luck, with the hope that next time we're not going to meet again to discuss the 11th or 12th year of the mediation paradox, but we will be here celebrating the on switch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Di Palo, for this very convincing plaidoyer. Now the floor is open for questions from the audience, or maybe not only questions, but comments or examples of how mediation works well or not well in member states. Yes. I don't see, so Maria will comment.
Sì. I would like to make a comment, because you said that the legislators of the Union failed in giving instructions to the... But the mediation directive was a very peculiar, a very difficult piece of legislation, because when the Union began with the process to adopt this directive, that it took a lot of years. So the process began in 2000 or something like that, with the first white book, etc. And the entry into force, I think it was the end of the period of transposition, it was 2012 or even. Then, so the first problem is that mediation didn't exist in some member states when the mediation directive was adopted. So the Parliament, the European Parliament, was not unanimous on this piece of legislation because of problems of subsidiarity, in fact. Because the mediation directive is based in internal market legal basis, nothing else was at the beginning. And it means that you are harmonizing things that doesn't exist. And it was a very difficult process. So it's only, I only wanted to make this comment, because this explained a lot of the difficulties that the mediation directive had and the lack of homogeneity in the transposition. Thank you.
Well, thank you, first of all. Fail was intentionally... okay, now it's okay. Fail was intentionally intended to catch your attention as well. But I think it's not a misnomer. Because you're right, the process actually started in 1999 in Tampere. The proposal was presented in 2004, and then 2008 it was adopted. I actually had the privilege to speaking in this very place in 2007, the year before it was adopted. And because I started mediating in 1995, I kind of felt that Article 5.2 would not be enough. So I started to say, when everybody was so excited eventually to have a European law, well, I'm not sure it's going to work. And I felt like those guys who go to a party, right, and everybody's excited, they go to the host and say, hey, I know where there is a better party. Everybody looked at me like, let's enjoy the mediation law we're about to have. Let's not talk about the future. When I say fail, is that the European legislator had in mind what would work and what would not work. The Italian legislation dates back to 1993. Some countries did not have it, some did. The French legislation dated 1994. So what was working, what was able to create a market, a demand and a supply was known. But that's all right. Nobody is perfect, including this parliament, with all due respect. But from 2008 until 2018, the parliament commissioned a study in 2011, and okay, it was too soon. Then 2014, then 2016, that's the time to take stock that if we're looking at the process still from Tampere, 1999, 19 years, is a little too much. Whereas we know what the switch is. It's not about changing people's head. It's really about making the right legislative choice. And see how it goes. The beauty of the most effective legislation pieces on mediation is that they set for trial periods. They didn't say this is the solution. Let's give it a try. Let's keep opt-in, but let's also have opt-out. In certain federal states, Australia, for example, certain states have an opt-in model and others have the opt-out model. And you can compare in the same culture the different impact of those models. So that is why I meant fail. So I take it back, but just 50% of it in a mediated fashion. Thank you for your comments.
I would like, as you made an explanation by the psychology of citizens, so do you have also an explanation of the psychology of MEPs? Why they didn't, against better insight, decide? Is it?
I think I do. Okay. It was one of your colleagues that when I first spoke to this audience many years ago, instead of using the word required or required effort as I did today, I spoke of mandatory. And she told me, I still remember, won't tell the name, I'm from the right side, and to me, anything that is mandatory is bad. So I don't want to hear what you have to say. A lot of parliaments have gotten stuck with the notion that mandatory is bad. If we look at Article 5.2, in fact, it seems to instill the idea that making mediation required would be bad. It says, if you remember, member states are free to do that, provided the right of access to justice is not infringed. Could we imagine a directive that would allow the member state to do so? So the very notion that that is a risky area instilled the idea that mediation was almost taboo. A distinguished colleague of mine from the Netherlands speaks of tribalism. Anytime we speak about mediation as something to be required, two tribes come up, the ones in favor, the ones against. The proposal that you saw is actually practicing what we preach, is a mediated solution between these two tribes. On the one hand, we have data proving over and over that mediation as a fully voluntary opt-in system will not work, has not worked anywhere in the world. If any in this room has different indications, let me know. So that will not work. On the other hand, we cannot oblige people to settle. So we're not doing this. We're doing something in between, which is to try to bring people to make an effort. And then we monitor. Forcing people to make an effort has a cost. At the end of the year, how many cases have settled? What is the user satisfaction? What do people say? What do lawyers say? Initially, lawyers have been very opposed. In some of the countries where the opposition even led to strikes, Argentina many years ago, Italy about 7 years ago, the legal profession is now amongst the strongest supporters of mediation. So resistance is to be expected. Fear by politicians to embrace something new is also to be expected. But looking carefully at what other countries are doing would lead to clear indications about what is doable and what should be tested and what is certainly not going to work. So courage and looking around more at other models would be my short answer to you.
I don't want to transform that in a dialogue, but I suppose I was in this side of the table in 2007 when you were there. And the fact is, I was not shocked by the word failure. In fact, I agree with this possible analysis, because this is the reason why in the mediation directive is in the program, is because it's a good example of something that is not really working. I mean, it's working in every member state individually considered in a way or in another. But the differences in application that you have shown in your graphics shows, in fact, that there is not homogeneity at all, and that we have not succeeded in harmonizing or developing really at the same level for everybody mediation. That is the thing. That is the conclusion. I don't know if you agree with this.
I'm going to actually agree, and I'm going to contradict myself, because the mediation model that works actually comes from the directive. The Italian law is based on the directive. The Turkish law was inspired. And the Greek law, which has now been suspended, is modeled after the Italian. And the mother of all is the directive. The point is, the directive has been so little directive, pun intended, therefore has given too much latitude to legislators. And some have been too timid, some have been too aggressive, and they have not found the middle ground. I wish that the legislator could have led and nudged the legislator into the right thing to do. In that regard, I think that after 10 years, we can call it a failure. But again, the directive has proven its effectiveness, but it took years. The Italian law of 2013 comes after 2 or 3 years of constitutional litigation. Some people didn't want it the way, some people wanted the way. At the end of the day, a third way was found, a middle ground. If the provision had been in the directive, the one I showed you, something like that, there would not have been any concerns. Certainly not as far as the constitutionality according to the Court of Justice, because that had been spelled out. So with more directions, the directive would have been more impactful. That would be the conclusion I think we can both agree with.